Was How to Train Your Dragon live action worth making? Is it worth watching? Did it even merit the Hollywood resources that went into its getting made? In a Hollywood environment rife with live action adaptations of classic animated films, this is maybe our most recent movie to be remade. How to Train Your Dragon came out in like 2010. Most of our other live action remakes are based on older movies. They've had more time to take a backseat in the cultural memory, mind space, zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it. I watched the remake and walked straight out of the theater to watch the original to compare the two, but more importantly, to examine if the live action brought enough to the material to warrant actually being made. Is too much of what made the original so great intrinsic to the artistic medium of animation, or does the 2025 adaptation capture the magic just fine in its translation to live action? I'm going to start off with what the live action does wrong, then what it gets right, and then we'll dive in on did it warrant being made, and do these adaptations in general warrant being made? What the live action gets wrong. The pacing is off. The live action isn't necessarily a shot-for-shot remake, but it comes really close. And yet the original is about a half hour shorter. There's only one added scene that I can think of, and it's not long enough to make up for that difference in time. A lot of what contributes to our longer runtime here is due to the medium change from animation to live action. The two movies can have the exact same scene with the exact same lines, but the animated version moves through that bit of story much quicker. It snaps through the scenes in a way that the live action either doesn't or just can't due to the storytelling medium, and it bogs down the experience. I don't want to be a hypocrite, because one of my biggest issues with a lot of these live action remakes has been these classic stories being changed too much. But here, I see that just doing the cartoon in live action, completely one-to-one redoing it, also doesn't work. Which brings me back to my central question. Separate of, is there a demand for these movies, which is a question that gets mixed answers, just look at the box score return on these different remakes. Does this movie warrant being made? I found myself enjoying the jokes much more in our animated story. 2025 not only has less jokes, but they really don't land as well either, partially due to the physical comedy not working, but also because there's a certain goofy charm native to animation that just doesn't translate. Speaking of things that don't translate, our character acting here. In the original, our characters often have these big, overblown facial expressions that's natural to animation. They don't feel off at all. It's cartoonish, but it's in fact a cartoon, so it works. In our remake, most of these actors have the unenviable task of trying to recreate these expressions as real human people, not cartoons. I don't want to bag on our actors too much because it very much feels like a directorial mandate rather than a choice the actors went with. It's the worst, or at least it's the most evident with our actor for Hiccup. I kind of feel bad for the kid, honestly, because he's not exactly giving us a good performance, but it seems to be, for the most part, out of his control. He's trying his best to be Hiccup from the original movie, but it's impossible to pull off copying a cartoon that directly, that one-to-one. There's also a lot of moments with our animated version when Hiccup's alone or just with Toothless, he's saying his thoughts out loud. In live action, it doesn't really make sense for our main character or characters in general to really just be saying what they're thinking out loud all the time so much. So that just leaves our actor here dangling with these extended shots of him having these silly looks on his face, trying to emote all these lines that Hiccup says in the original by himself, just with his face. And the acting issue can be seen with the rest of our teenager actors too. The adults in the movie don't fully escape it, but our teen actors have some of the more egregious moments of it in this movie. I won't go so far as to say these are bad actors, but we for sure aren't getting great performances. The costuming really threw me for a loop at first because it looked so silly in the live action, but when I went back and watched the original, they made complete carbon copies of the costumes from the animation. Now I can respect not wanting to change your source material, but it leaves most of our actors out here running around in what is essentially cosplay. The one exception being Stoic. They have him in this giant coat that kind of worked. It was meant to fill out the insane cartoonish frame of Stoic in the animation, but it kind of worked for me. One thing that 1,000,000% did not work was that wig the DreamWorks Universal Costume Department had Astrid in. It was insane. It was so blocky, it looked like a helmet on her head. I can't believe that passed through multiple levels of review and made it into this huge budget movie because it looks terrible. I feel bad for the actress. Honestly, it seems like that thing was so heavy it might have been hurting her neck because it was so blocky. It was a big old helmet on her head. Now let's talk about the character interactions and the relationships in this film. I don't want to say the character beats don't hit at all in the live action because flatly, it wouldn't be true. There's a lot of moments where you feel for Hiccup and you feel his struggle to be like his dad, like his tribe, and his need for acceptance. The problem is though, that these emotional moments that work in the live action work better and hit home more in the animation. Aside from one interaction with Gobber early on, the emotional beats in general work better in the animation. And one core emotional moment from the original is the scene when Hiccup's dad returns from his hunt for the nest and finds that Hiccup has made a fine dragon fighter out of himself. And he's proud of him, and he wants to talk to him about how he's proud of him. And there's this line that was in the original that for some reason got cut out of the live action, where Stoic says, "Now we finally have something to talk about." I don't know why that line was cut out, because I think it was very necessary to tell the audience, to communicate to the audience Stoic's side of that rift created by his son being so different from him. That longing for connection is communicated just not as well as it was in the original. The whole scene in the original also feels a lot clearer, quicker, and snappier in the communication. I do want to touch on Astrid again before moving on. She somehow had more screen time in the remake, but less to do. She's a good bit less central to the core emotional through line here. It's not that she has less lines, but they get reordered a bit in a way that make her feel less connected to Hiccup's story. And before I move on to the positives, one last thing that took me out of the remake was the physical aspect. Characters were blasted with fire, or in general took hits or falls that should kill or maim any person. And it's fine animation of course, but in live action, some of these impacts just felt too hard for a person to take. I know it's a kid's movie, but they communicated these impacts so well that it felt off just seeing these characters shake it off. That's most of what I saw that was worse or lost in the translation, but now I want to talk about what was made better for being adapted. The flying. Oh my god, the flying. The flying scenes were so much better in live action. Our flying scenes were fine in the original, they worked, they did their best to show the wonder of flight, but oh my gosh, the majesty of flight was incredible and so tangible in this movie. This team really knocked it out of the park here, especially on Hiccup's first flight and his second flight with Astrid. Not so much in the final conflict because there was so much else going on that the focus on just the flight kind of strayed a bit away and it wasn't as immersive. I almost want to go back to the theater now just to see those two scenes in 3D because it was Avatar-esque. Now before all 11 Avatar stands attack me, I'm not saying it was better or even as good as the flight in Avatar, but it's definitely the next best thing. I realized midway through the first flight sequence that a huge smile had crept across my face. I was sat there like this. It was honestly such a wonderful experience sitting through those scenes. Not every movie has a moment like that grabs you. A lot of movies don't have any moments that give you that full immersion. The remake had me in the palm of its hand for the duration of those two sequences. Also, the CGI on the dragons was by and large really good. The beasts were a lot more interesting to look at in the live action without the team straying away from the cartoon designs. The two-headed one in particular had moments that looked so much better than they did in animation. And one last positive is that the story as a whole is still a good coming-of-age story between a father and a son. That's not exactly the product of the live-action translation, but just a core part of the How to Train a Dragon story that I guess the remake team does deserve credit for not changing. All of this brings me back to the central question, was this movie worth making? My answer to the more general question, are all of these live-action remakes worth making? I don't think so. Not that they don't have merit or can't be good, but for the budget that these huge projects get, I have to question if all these resources wouldn't be better spent split up to tell original stories. For the cost of one of these remakes, in general, a studio could produce 3 to 5 even lower budget movies, indie comedies, horror stories, character-driven dramas, or even they could put all the budget into one big new original kids movie. Even when these remakes work, there's largely more value to risking an original story as opposed to a pastiche, even a good pastiche, of a story we've already seen as a collective audience, a story we already have. With all that said, I do think the live action adaptation was worth making, was worth the resources, if only for the sheer magic of those two flight scenes. They knocked it so far out of the park with that it makes up for all of the other shortcomings of the adaptation. I can see a whole generation of young kids making their parents replay this movie a dozen times solely for those two spellbinding sequences. All in all, this movie was very mixed, but they did so good on those two sequences that I have to say it was worth making. Thank you for watching. Come back for more.